Sydney and all surrounding areas for the past 40 years, and hopefully they will be continuing their work for many years to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to rise today to speak about Portland Estates and Portland Hills Residents Association. For 20 years, the Residents Association has tirelessly worked on improving the ever-growing neighbourhoods of Portland Estates and Portland Hills, whether through community events or launching initiatives like their annual spring cleanup. I was glad to assist in the most recent spring cleanup of litter and debris throughout the walking paths and parks within the neighborhood. It was a pleasure seeing all those that came out to help, the many folks of all ages, young people and so on. The association also takes the lead in bringing to light environmental issues.
Time allotted for member statements has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Yesterday, in media reports, the Premier's Chief of Staff repeatedly and publicly disclosed sensitive, personal, private medical information about a member of this House. Mr. Speaker, on whose authority did the Premier's Chief of Staff tell all about a member's private, personal medical history?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition would know that the member for Dartmouth East has filed a complaint in relation to the issue that he refers to. As a result of the fact that there is a complaint filed, we will certainly respect that process and not make further comments on it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is not acceptable. Whether what happened yesterday was illegal or not, that will be decided in the courts. But whether such a despicable act, whether such an immoral act is given the stamp of approval by this government or not, that is the question. They have every right and ability and responsibility to be clear as a government about whether they agree with giving out private medical information of an employee when it's someone they don't agree with. But, Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the Premier a very simple question. Does he truly believe it's okay to give out private medical information on an employee of the government or a member of this House just to save someone's job?
I remind the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition that the term immoral is unparliamentary. The Honourable and despicable. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, again, as has been pointed out, the fact is that there has been a complaint made in relation to this matter. We will certainly respect the complaint process, ensure that it is dealt with, and it would be inappropriate to make further comments until such time as that complaint has been addressed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the government comes here to this House in question period to answer for its own responsibility in these matters, and it cannot hide behind the courts. I'm not asking the government or the Premier to give a legal opinion. I'm asking them to express whether they agree with what was said publicly yesterday in the release of private medical information or not. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that there is a Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act in this province, and in Section 20 it says, and I quote, the personal information relates it says, and I quote, personal information is an unreasonable invasion of privacy if the personal information relates to a medical, dental, psychological, or other health care history. That's exactly what happened yesterday, Mr. Speaker. Why did the government ignore this important piece of legislation when they went into damage control mode yesterday?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated previously, there's been a complaint that has been filed in relation to this matter. As a result of that, we will certainly respect that complaint process, and it would be inappropriate to comment any further on the matter.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, under Nova Scotia's Personal Health Information Act, passed in 2010, health care providers are explicitly prohibited from releasing an individual's personal health information without their consent. And there are severe penalties for breaching this act, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister of Health is this. Would the Minister of Health please explain why it's important to not release personal health information without a patient's consent.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as indicated earlier, there has been a complaint that has been filed in relation to this matter. It would be inappropriate to comment further until such time as the complaint has been dealt with. We will certainly respect the processes that we have in place in this province in order to ensure that this complaint is dealt with appropriately.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apparently, the Minister of Health isn't allowed to talk about policy in his department, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, perhaps he's no longer going to be the Minister of Health, but nevertheless, this question will go again to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's Chief of Staff yesterday, unprompted, released personal health information of a member of the legislature without this individual's consent. So my question to the Minister of Health is this: would he please explain whether or not he agrees with the release of personal health information without consent by the Premier's Chief of Staff?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as previously indicated, there has been a complaint that has been filed in relation to this matter. I believe that the acting leader of the NDP knows full well, having been in this House for as long as she has, that it would be absolutely inappropriate to make comments in relation to the fact once a complaint has been filed. As a result of that, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to respect the process until it is finalized.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a final question that's not about the complaint that's been filed. I see the member from the Amherst area is very happy that there's a question that's not about complaints. There are so many complaints about members of that government and the Premier's staff, it's hard to keep them straight, Mr. Speaker. So I can see why he'd be excited. But, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister of Health is this: is why should there be a double standard where healthcare providers who disclose a person's personal health information are punished, but the Premier's Chief of Staff apparently can do no wrong?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would point out to the Honourable Acting Leader of the NDP a Saturday, May 22nd article of 2010, which says Dexter's Chief of Staff, anonymous story critic. And the headline goes on: O'Connor denies, then admits to sending comments to Chronicle Herald website, panning article about cost of energy strategy rollout. Mr. Speaker, if I'm not mistaken, following this story...
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Government House Leader has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, if I'm not mistaken, the Premier of the day maintained confidence in his Chief of Staff for a further 3 years.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, you know, there's precedent here. In 1990, a Minister of Health in this House released private personal medical information about a deputy minister, an employee of the government, Mr. Speaker. That case ended up in court, and that minister lost his job. Mr. Speaker, disclosing a person's personal private medical history because you don't agree with what they've done is just wrong, Mr. Speaker. So does the Premier today agree that that same consequence should happen when an employee of his government goes ahead and releases private medical information, just like happened back with that minister in 1990?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, a complaint has been filed in this matter. I believe it's the House's duty to respect the process, to see to it that this complaint is dealt with under the structures that we have here in this province. I believe the Leader of the Official Opposition knows it would be completely inappropriate to be discussing matters of this specific nature in light of the fact that a complaint has been filed. We'll continue to respect that process.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, what we know is that a government that campaigned to be open and transparent and accountable daring to call themselves the most open in Canada, won't answer simple questions about what the Chief of Staff to the Premier did and whose approval he had to do it. Mr. Speaker, perfectly open and legitimate questions in this House. And that minister that's answering today, he is a former Minister of Justice, and he knows that employers have an obligation to keep private medical information from their employees. And yet the government flagrantly violated that principle yesterday, ignoring their obligation to their own people, Mr. Speaker. This is just the latest in this long-running drama. So I'll ask the minister directly, in light of this most recent revelation, why does Kirby McVicker still have his job?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I know that I've had the privilege to hold a number of portfolios during my career, and even at times I may get confused as to those portfolios, but I have never served as Minister of Justice or Attorney General. As pointed out by the Leader of the Official Opposition, at least up till now, I'm sure you would not want to be accused of misleading the House by making such allegations. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that a complaint has been launched in regards to this matter, and as a result of that, Mr. Speaker, we are going to respect that process and see it dealt with appropriately.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, mental illness among Canadians is quite common. Mr. Speaker, statistics show that 1 in 5 Canadians experience mental illness at some point in their lives. And it's long been known that the stigma associated with mental illness is one of the biggest reasons people fail to seek treatment. Mr. Speaker, I wonder if the Minister of Health could explain what steps he has taken to ensure that the stigma associated with mental illness is reduced or eliminated.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm pleased to say that as recently as last week, when Michael Wilson was attending the luncheon for the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia, he pointed out how strongly the work is going on in our province in terms of dealing with the stigma around mental health, and in particular the program Working Minds, that now over 2,000 government employees have engaged in, and that it's already seen its value in the workplace. Over 200 instructors at the Nova Scotia Community College have also taken part in this program, and there are others that the Mental Health the Mental Health Advisory Council of Canada see as being very strong and active in our province.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's Chief of Staff disclosed without permission a mental health diagnosis in an attempt to embarrass a person who is in a very public fight with the Premier and his government, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of Health, what justification is there for stigmatizing a person with a diagnosis for which we want people to seek treatment?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the acting leader of the NDP knows very well that a complaint has been filed in regards to this matter. It would be inappropriate to be having these types of discussions on the floor of the House or even outside the House when such a complaint is yet to have been properly dealt with. Mr. Speaker, we will respect the process we have in place in our province and allow the complaint to go through its normal courses.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in 2006, the press secretary to the Premier of New Brunswick released a letter containing personal information about a constituent. That press secretary lost his job. He resigned. He admitted that he'd made a mistake, and his own Premier gave him credit for owning up to his mistake, but he accepted his resignation. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier today is, who should hold Mr. McVicker responsible for doing the exact same thing here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I believe the Leader of the Official Opposition is aware that a complaint was filed this morning. As a result of that, Mr. Speaker, it would be inappropriate to be discussing the specific matters of this case. We will respect the process and allow the complaint to be dealt with.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, there is no reason in law or otherwise why the government can't answer very direct and simple questions about who holds the Chief of Staff responsible for his actions, what the role of the Premier is in taking responsibility for this whole sorry mess, and who gave the authority to do such a horrible thing as to give out someone's private medical history in an attempt to embarrass that person and save the Chief of Staff's job. Mr. Speaker, that is just wrong, and there is nothing that holds the government back from saying so. Mr. Speaker, here we are. We have a Chief of Staff who, under someone's direction, took direct action to try and embarrass a member of the House that doesn't agree with the government on a pretty big issue. So I'd like to ask the Minister if he agrees with the Premier's action today to basically do nothing and thereby condone this whole sorry episode.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Official Opposition will forgive me if I don't accept his legal advice that he wishes to offer to this House. Mr. Speaker, instead, I would say that we have a complaint which has been filed. As a result of that, it would be inappropriate to be discussing this matter either on the floor of this House or outside. We will respect the process and allow the complaint to be heard and dealt with.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. There is no legal advice that the Minister has that says he can't talk about it. He may have political advice or damage control advice, but he does not have legal advice, because if he did, he'd know he could be answering these questions today. Mr. Speaker, on November 19th, just a few short days ago, in a media interview, the Minister of Energy was asked, does Kirby McVicker still have a job? And his answer was absolutely. And then he was asked, does he still have the confidence of the Premier? And the Minister then said, absolutely. And he has the confidence of the Cabinet and our entire government. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, is that statement of November 19th stating that the Chief of Staff has the confidence of the Cabinet still true today?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, as the Leader of the Official Opposition is aware, a complaint was filed this morning regarding to this matter. It would be inappropriate, Mr. Speaker, to be debating this issue on the floor of this House or even outside of this House. We will respect the complaint that has been filed and allow it to work through its normal course.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we'll take that as a no, and no wonder, because today, November 24th, that same minister was asked, do you still have full confidence in the Chief of Staff? And his answer changed from what it was just 5 days ago, Mr. Speaker. His answer was, the relationship between the Chief of Staff is with the Premier. Therefore, I'm not in a position to comment. Well, he was in full position to comment 5 days ago that the Chief of Staff had the confidence of the Cabinet, of which he is a member. But conveniently, he dropped that part of the confidence in his answer to the same question today. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister get up and just state the obvious, that what the Chief of Staff did yesterday was wrong and he should lose his job because of it?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as the Leader of the Official Opposition is aware, a complaint was filed this morning regarding this matter. He knows full well it's completely inappropriate to discuss this matter on the floor of this House or even outside of this House. We'll respect the complaint process that has been initiated, and we will await to see the results of that process.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question for you is to the Deputy Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's Chief of Staff has told several media outlets yesterday, including the Chronicle Herald, that his conversation in February with the member for Dartmouth East was a, quote, unofficial conversation, Mr. Speaker. Now, I can't help but wonder how Nova Scotians can tell the difference between an official and an unofficial conversation with the Premier's Chief of Staff. So my question to the Deputy Premier is this. Could she please clarify for us what the difference is between an official and an unofficial conversation?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
As the acting leader of the NDP is well aware, a complaint was filed this morning in relation to this matter. I believe she's been in this House as long as I have, which, for those who are counting, it's 17 years. During that time, she has been a minister of different portfolios, and she's well aware of the processes we have in place in our province. And when she would have been a minister, she would have taken the same approach as indicating how inappropriate it would be to be debating this type of a complaint on the floor of the House before the complaint had been dealt with. Nothing has changed from when she was a minister to when we are ministers in respecting the processes that are in place.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've been here long enough to know the difference between a Premier and a Deputy Premier and a House Leader. And it's concerning that the Deputy Premier isn't being allowed to ask questions, answer questions as well, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Deputy Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has told us repeatedly that his staff, in particular his Chief of Staff, speak for him, and that's a direct quote. Yet he also maintains he was unaware of countless conversations, disclosures and job offers made by his Chief of Staff over the last 12 months. So my question to the Deputy Premier, Mr. Speaker, is how can the Premier's Chief of Staff speak for him if he never speaks to him?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it was interesting in a scrum last week when the acting leader of the NDP was being asked questions relating to this matter. And at one point, the press challenged her and said, "Isn't this just you playing politics?" And her response was, "That's what we do." Enough said.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question this afternoon through you is to the Minister of Transportation. He knew it. Mr. Speaker, in a recent article published by the Chronicle Herald, regarding new toll highways throughout Nova Scotia, or at least the assessment, there was a question asked through a number of my constituents, and I'll ask it on their behalf today, regarding this opinion piece, the idea of a high-speed rail network throughout some of these same areas in Nova Scotia. And I would like to ask the Minister, is such a thing being considered during the study or the assessment of toll highways across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. The quick answer to that, Mr. Speaker, is no. With respect to the capital costs associated with our rail beds, we're having a tough time keeping those we have in place on the ground now, and as the member knows, there's a number of processes for that in place. But with respect to any commuter travel or passenger travel, Mr. Speaker, my personal opinion is that we just don't have the critical numbers. I haven't received any of those suggestions or any ideas that there is outside of downtown here in Metro. I don't know if there's a commuter model that would be viable. So I haven't certainly heard that. Like anything else, we're open to information. But, Mr. Speaker, from our perspective, from a capital side and from a marketing side, I just don't know if those numbers would add up. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I guess I'll just follow up. He spoke about the rail bids, the condition they're in. I think everyone knows that. We also, the article goes on to mention the actual cost, and the Minister would know the cost well of the twinning of highways, the very expensive amount of money, and so very interesting, the comparison. It almost sounds like there's been some comparison done, maybe in what high-speed rail would cost, if I heard that correctly. But to follow up, will the rail bids be kept in the status they're in by way of ownership as it stands today?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that question. It is an important one. I think that when you look at the different rail beds we have across the province, there are different ownership groups, obviously different business models associated with those. So really, it's a case by case. Again, when you look at what CN has here in the operation downtown Metro, there is viability in alternative services, I think, and HRM, some of the MPs, and of course at the provincial level, there's been some measure of discussion. But with respect to the rail detail again that the capital cost is very significant, probably comparable with some of that major highway development. But then you're into that viability of the market and what the passenger count looks like. You take Via Rail, for example. They subsidize a number of runs for this exact reason. So when you look at populations, it's hard to justify that critical mass that's required to pay the bills. Thanks a lot.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. My question is for the Robo-Minister over there today. Mr. Speaker, a formal...
Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A formal complaint about the disclosure of personal information by the Premier's Chief of Staff was lodged today. The Minister has been repeatedly referring to that. Mr. Speaker, it alleges a pretty serious breach of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So I'd like to ask the Minister, so we can get on with some answers here, will he direct the FOIPOP officer to deal with the complaint right away so we can get on with answering questions that Nova Scotians deserve an answer to here in this House?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the province of Nova Scotia has established standards when it comes to dealing with complaints. Leader of the Official Opposition is aware of that. That process is what will be used now that a complaint has been launched on this. He knows very well that it would be inappropriate to be discussing any matters relating to this now that a complaint has been filed. We've indicated that we will respect the complaint process and we will await the results of that before commenting further.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the province of Nova Scotia has established standards about not disclosing personal information, but that got flagrantly violated. The province of Nova Scotia has established standards about not offering a job to the wife of a member of the House, Mr. Speaker, but that's been violated. Suddenly, the government wants to enforce a standard about the Freedom of Information officer when all we're asking is that that person deal with the complaint right away so we can get on with the answers that Nova Scotians deserve to know. Well, I'll ask the Minister. There is no standard that says the rulings of the Freedom of Information officer can't be made public. Will he commit today, on behalf of the government, that the findings on this complaint will be made public at the earliest possible opportunity?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the complaint was made this morning, mere hours ago. That complaint will be dealt with throughout our existing systems that we have here in the province of Nova Scotia and will be dealt with as all other complaints are. Any Nova Scotian who feels they wish to issue a complaint, I believe everyone should be treated fairly when it comes to that. That's how the system is set up to deal with those types of complaints. We will respect the process and we will await to see the results of that complaint.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, disclosing private personal medical information was not the only interesting thing that the Chief of Staff had to say yesterday. It turns out that when he offered the wife of the member for Dartmouth East a job, he said that he would talk to the Deputy Minister about it. However, yesterday he said he was considering a job in the Liberal caucus office. Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know Deputy Ministers do not hire people for political party caucus offices, Mr. Speaker. They are making up their defence as they go along. Well, ask the Minister directly, why would the Chief of Staff need to talk to a Deputy Minister if the job was merely one in the Liberal caucus office?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that it has been indicated by the Chief of Staff that the recording is not reflective of the entire conversation. What we have and what you have ruled today is that you've accepted that the member for Dartmouth East statement that he provided what he recorded. It has been stated that there was a further conversation that did take place that we do not have the recordings. Therefore, only 2 individuals were parties to that specific discussion. Mr. Speaker, one of those has launched a complaint this morning. As I've indicated, we have a process in place to deal with such complaints. It would be inappropriate to be discussing this matter further until that complaint is dealt with, a process for which we will fully respect.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the government wasn't satisfied when we had a snippet of this conversation. Then they weren't satisfied when we had 2 snippets of this conversation. Now they have 12 whole minutes where the Chief of Staff lays out his plan to make sure that the member for Dartmouth East's wife has a personal services contract, Mr. Speaker. They can say it's under investigation. We have an RCMP investigation now. We have a complaint to the FOIPOP officer now, Mr. Speaker. How many investigations have to be launched before someone is held accountable over there for the actions of this Premier's office?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind the Leader of the Official Opposition that his entire caucus voted in favour of the motion from this House to obtain the full recording. The opposition party, with the NDP, voted in full support. It was a unanimous motion of this House asking for that full recording. You have made a ruling today accepting that what was recorded was actually disclosed. It has been indicated that there was a further conversation that took place that is not recorded. Again, since a complaint has been filed this morning, it would be inappropriate to discuss this matter further until such time as the complaint process has been concluded.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Internal Services, who oversees much of the processes with respect to enforcing privacy and confidentiality of personal information. Mr. Speaker, I have a very simple question for the Minister of Internal Services, and that is, what policy exists, what is the policy around releasing the health information without permission of a patient for his office?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the acting leader of the NDP is aware that a complaint was filed this morning in relation to the matter for which she raises a question. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned last week in a scrum when challenged by the press on this very issue, the acting leader of the NDP was asked, "Are you not just playing politics?" And her response was, "That's what we do." Mr. Speaker, what we do in the government is focus on the issues that face Nova Scotia families, and we're making sure that Nova Scotians get the good government that they deserve. That is what we will remain focused on.
The Honourable Acting Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't need to be mansplained to in this legislature about what the role of the opposition is with respect to asking tough questions. But, Mr. Speaker, that member should be reminded of what his duty is in terms of answering tough questions and being accountable to the people of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have an additional question for the Minister of Internal Services, and that is simply this. What penalty is there for anyone who improperly releases personal health information without permission from a patient?
There you go. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, the acting leader of the NDP, again, as I pointed out last week, made it very clear what her intent was on this issue, and it was to play politics. Mr. Speaker, we're seeing it on display again here today when the opposition has an opportunity to raise questions on behalf of Nova Scotians on so many issues. Mr. Speaker, I will again reiterate, our government remains focused on providing good government to the people of this province. Nova Scotians are seeing some of the strategic investments that we are making. They're seeing the results of new programs and results of new initiatives. Mr. Speaker, we will remain focused on providing that good government.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Procurement, Internal Services and Procurement. There was a high-profile contract in tourism recently awarded to a company from outside Nova Scotia, and many Nova Scotians scratched their heads wondering how such an important contract could be awarded to a company from Ontario. And this was especially a slap in the face to the many local companies that spent many hours and thousands of dollars preparing their bid. Mr. Speaker, people are wondering, how often does this happen? So my question for the Minister today is the Minister aware of how many contracts were awarded to companies based outside of Nova Scotia so far this year?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Trampoline, who was the co-winner of that contract. Mr. Speaker, Trampoline is located just right here on Barrington Street. I would also like to add, in that contract, it's $6 million a year, $5 million of which is media buying, and DDB is the largest media buyer in Canada. They do this exact same work for the Government of Canada. I would also like to add that we put a goal in front for this RFP, which stated we want to double tourism in Nova Scotia, which is an Ivany goal, which the opposition seems to be in favour of. And, Mr. Speaker, ironically enough, every single Nova Scotia company partnered up with a larger firm so they could get that buying power and deliver it to Nova Scotians, doubling tourism. So I'm not sure where this complaint is coming from, but it's not coming from the bidders because they all had partners that were non-Nova Scotia companies.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And clearly the minister is unsure of something. It was a simple question: how many contracts are awarded to companies outside of Nova Scotia? He doesn't know the answer. I think Nova Scotians will be really disappointed that the minister doesn't care about Nova Scotia companies, doesn't care about jobs here. So I'm going to ask it I'll try another way. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The honourable member for Pictou East has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought if we got another minister on his feet, we might get an answer, but sadly, Mr. Speaker, not today. So many people are asking, what sort of metric must the government be looking at when they award these things out? When I'm talking to Nova Scotians who lost their job, they often ask me, does the government think they're saving money? So my question for the minister today is quite simply, from their voices, does the government think they're saving money by sending business out of the province?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, quick geography lesson. Barrington Street's a block behind us, and the co-winner of that contract is a Nova Scotia company. Mr. Speaker, procurement in the province of Nova Scotia, 81% of all procurement goes to Nova Scotia companies. We are leaders in Canada. Mr. Speaker, we balance finding the best company to deliver services for Nova Scotia and supporting Nova Scotia companies, and Nova Scotia is a leader in it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, workers at Hilton Foods were dealt some devastating news recently when they were told that by Oxford Frozen Foods, the carrot plant was closing and 98 seasonal jobs were being lost. The municipality of Kings County Council has stepped forward and offered their support in treating wastewater. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is this. Knowing this, will the Minister of Agriculture today inform this House and residents of the Annapolis Valley what his department did or what support they offered to prevent the closure of Hilton Foods?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much for that question. Unfortunately, that's a decision by a private company. I'm very excited to see that the municipalities work with the company, and we look forward to them to keeping the facility open under a different mandate.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the minister for that answer. I'm not sure what it was that he said that they actually did. Mr. Speaker, in the Premier's constituency of Annapolis, King's Produce Processing, situated in the town of Milton, gave workers 2 days' notice earlier this month on the closure of this business. 40 to 50 full-time jobs are vital in such a small town as Milton. Many farmers are concerned about the loss of agricultural processing capacity in Nova Scotia. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the minister is this. What is the Minister of Agriculture doing to ensure agricultural food processing is going to continue in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
We're very dedicated to ensure that processing continues in the province. It's added value to the province. Unfortunately, when private companies make decisions, we're no longer going to run in with government money and try to bail them out because it doesn't work. It's official opposition did it in the past, and the last government did it as well. It doesn't work. We have to go to a free market situation, and that's what happened in this case.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. the Education Action Plan released earlier this year by the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development is an ambitious response to address concerns raised in the Freeman Report. It's clear that teachers will need to play a significant role on the front lines implementing change. And in response to the plan, the NSTU President, Shelley Morse, said, and I quote, "We want to work with the department to ensure that the voice of active teachers is included in the changes coming forward that impact current practice and policy in public education." And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. But therefore, my question for the Minister is this. Beyond the feedback encompassed in the Freeman Report, how have teachers actually been consulted and engaged in the creation and implementation of the Education Action Plan?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the question. I'm very pleased to remind the member that teachers have been engaged from the get-go with the action plan. In fact, Mr. Speaker, over 5,000 teachers responded and gave us their opinions about what we needed to do within the action plan to make sure that public education continued to grow in this province and that the learning and teaching environment in the classroom was improved for both teachers and students. They gave us their feedback, and, Mr. Speaker, they have been involved in every step of the way in coming into our department. We are seeking their opinion. We value their opinion because, Mr. Speaker, they are the people that drive education in this province.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm glad to hear the Minister say that she feels teachers are the driving force, because actually what I'm hearing from teachers is they're very upset that they were not consulted properly. And in fact, they say that writing in and sending in their ideas on an online process is not called consultation. So, Mr. Speaker, over the last decade, there's been an increasing number of students placed on individual programs, plans, or IPPs. While the root causes of this result can be debated, it's clear that it is teachers who will have to address ongoing changes related to classroom curriculum. Therefore, my question for the Minister is this. What kind of support is provided to teachers who are responsible for the delivery of IPPs?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to respond to part of the question, or an allegation, I guess, that was there, I think it's important, and teachers know this, I'll share with every member in the House this, that it was the teachers who came in, and it was the teachers who determined how we would streamline the curriculum, and it was the teachers who are committed to reducing the outcomes for kids.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you will be to the Minister of Department of Community Services. We all know the importance of what her department does and the people that she serves, Mr. Speaker, in this province, and I wonder if the Minister could give us an update on the benefit reform currently happening within her department.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for the question. One of the highest priorities of the department is making sure that the income assistance portion of the Department of Community Services is both effective and sustainable. So about 18 months ago, just after we were elected, we started a long-term process to really do comprehensive change and transformation within a system which, quite frankly, has not been working to meet the needs of people for a couple of decades now. So I'm very pleased to say that we've moved along a major restructuring within the upper echelons of administration, and the RFPs for trying to bring together the expertise in the community, also working with the people within the department who are the subject matter experts, hit the streets about 30 days ago, and we're moving along at the pace that we had determined.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Moving along, I wonder if she could be a little more clear on time frame, perhaps, on such a reform.
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Absolutely. We had said from the onset that this was going to be a three-phased approach, and we've just finished phase one, which took about 18 months. We're now beginning phase two, which we consider will take another year, a little more than a year. We're looking for complete, comprehensive overall of a system that hasn't been meeting the needs of people for many, many years, and we're looking at an end date for that to be 2018.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Many provinces have made the decision to become part of the national securities regulatory system. Having our own system simply duplicates what the national system could do, and it's redundant and creates red tape for business, Mr. Speaker. The previous Minister of Finance was quick to point out that having our own securities Commission generated $15 million in revenue for the province. So my question today is, will the minister admit that revenue is the only reason for refusing to join the national securities regulator?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. With respect to the national securities regulator, since I've started in my position as Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, I've been on the public record that we are considering and haven't closed the door on that option. But, Mr. Speaker, for the vast majority of time that I've been in this position, the federal government has been or was busy with the federal election campaign, which kind of put any discussions on hold. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's interesting to hear that there's investigation and research going on. It was 406 days ago that I stood in this House and asked the then Minister of Finance about it, and I heard at that time that there was a lot of time being investigated looking at this particular issue. So here we are, 406 days later. We have more collaboration between the Prime Minister and the provinces with each other. And on this issue, Nova Scotia is standing on the outside looking in. And I'm wondering why. So if the minister hasn't had, and the department haven't had enough time to determine whether the advantages are worth it, I would ask the minister today, can the minister tell us what disadvantages of joining the national system they've come across?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, what I'd like to advise the member opposite of actually, I believe on the order paper for today, we'll be talking a little bit more about what we do in the province of Nova Scotia to work on a national scale to harmonize our securities regulations. A lot of work that exists in reducing the red tape and the regulatory burden in the securities area, Mr. Speaker, and we're continuing to proceed in that vein. With respect to joining the national securities regulator, Mr. Speaker, what we've committed to, what my predecessor committed to, Mr. Speaker, was ensuring that if we enter into such an agreement, we'd make sure it's in the best interest of all Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been 26 years since the House of Commons vowed to end child poverty. Today, a report called End It Now by Leslie Frank, professor at Acadia University, provided a report card on child and family poverty in Nova Scotia. In Nova Scotia, child poverty rates are alarmingly high. Nova Scotia is home to the third highest child poverty rate in all of Canada, with 1 in 5 children living in poverty. These numbers increase when you look at Cape Breton, where 1 in 3 children live in poverty. Shocking. Young children under the age of 6 in the Cape Breton census area have a poverty rate of 42.7%.
Does the member have a question?
Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain how Nova Scotia has one of the highest rates of child poverty in Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for the question. Child poverty is something that as a government, that as a province, we all have a responsibility in. I am so encouraged by the recent announcements coming from the federal government that looks at raising, to stop sending, checks to millionaires, unlike the two parties across the way from me that they wanted to do and had continued to do federally, but will actually focus child tax credits on the families that need them, lifting hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. And I'm looking forward to working with my counterpart federally on that initiative, specifically as it pertains to the children of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, over the past 2 years, however, child and family poverty is on the rise. And last year, Leslie Frank, the same author who published this year's report, released a similar report on child and family poverty, and I will table that. The numbers haven't changed. In fact, the number of children using food banks has risen by 2%. In addition, 51% of food bank users are women, up 5%. Mr. Speaker, can the minister outline what specific steps her department is taking to address these high levels of child and family poverty and food insecurity?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
One of the most positive steps that I've seen happen over the last 2 years while we're in government is the investments within the women's community, specifically family resource centres, which had been under-resourced for at least a decade. Every single family resource centre now has at least $75,000 in investment that they have been doing programs like food security. They've been doing financial literacy. They've been doing crisis counseling. I still look forward to the time when the child tax benefit federally works hand in hand with the work that we're doing in benefit reform in Nova Scotia and actually making substantial change for families in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for the Office of the Ombudsman. It has been 21 months since Dwight Bishop retired, and we know the government has advertised for this position. They've had 81 applicants. They held interviews. They even had a successful candidate. But they've held off on hiring, and I'll table that information, Mr. Speaker. My question, why?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's certainly a concern to us as well, and I appreciate the member bringing up that issue, that having an effective ombudsman office is very important. We do have a very good acting ombudsman at the moment, so I'm very confident in the current service that's available. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I can appreciate there may be an acting ombudsman, but it puzzles a lot of people. Mr. Speaker, this government said they would be the most transparent province in the country, but it's 2 years later, and we have no full-time ombudsman.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 128, Labour Standards Code?
We'll now call Bill number 128, the Labour Standards Code. The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill 128, an act to amend Chapter 246 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Labour Standards Code, be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians shouldn't have to worry about what may happen to their job if they call Labour Standards to ask a question or to gather information for themselves or a colleague. The proposed amendment to the Labour Standards Code will clarify and enhance protections for employees who make Labour Standards inquiries or provide information to Labour Standards officials.